Hello, here I am again, Dr. Claude Anderson at the Powernomics.com YouTube channel. Here's where we connect the dots in history so that Black folk have a better understanding of where we are and how we got where we are. And equally as important, what we must come to learn to do to get out from where we are, because we're in a predicament that nobody wants to address. Not any political party or political candidate or a civil rights organization wants to address these issues. And unfortunately, the two organizations that really had the national visibility for addressing issues pertaining to Black folk, that was the Urban League and the NAACP, they are now basically irrelevant and defunct because what they did, they spent all their hopes on trying to make themselves attractive to major white corporations to get subsidies and have them subsidize them. And that's where they went, sold their souls to these corporations. And now these major corporations are going to abandon them and leave them with no place to go and no money to take them there. And so here we are right now again on the YouTube channel, connecting the dots to try to find out what can we do for Black folk in general. And what I'm gonna do today is try to address a couple of questions that were raised in the comments section of the Power Numbers YouTube channel. And let me take one for you. One was here, someone wrote in, and what was this? Here's this was Tyrone Shepard. This I must compliment him. This guy wrote an excellent question and comment, and I thank him for it. And that's the kind of thinking blacks I need. If I had about out of 46 million blacks in the country, if I had about half that number that were really critically analyzing our circumstances and trying to connect the dots on how we got into this mess and what we're going to do to get out of it, boy, we would get out of it real fast. But usually I tell people, and they say, Dr. Anderson, are we going to be able to do it? I said, we won't be able to do it until we learn how to understand critically what is necessary, what actions must we take to get out of it. And that's what the issue is. And right now, Black folk are not taking the appropriate steps, and they won't get out of it unless they get more pain. And I'm guarantee you that right now, that the power structure in this country is set to produce a lot of pain on Black folk, and it's starting with this 2020 election. But let's go back to Tyrone Shepard. He wrote an excellent comment, and he raised a question. Here's what his question was. Dr. Anderson, I have a very important Constitution question for you. Has the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision of the 1857, has it ever been reversed? He said, I've been reading conflicting opinions on this matter. He says, as a matter of fact, even former governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, let it slip from his mouth during his unsuccessful presidential run that the Dred Scott decision was still the law of the land. What is the law? Is that the truth? And what is the truth? Well, let me tell you, Huckabee really stumbled into the truth. And because most blacks don't know that the Dred Scott decision is still active. Now, what is the Dred Scott decision? In 1857, when Dred Scott stumbled his way up to the Supreme Court, being financed and subsidized by a few white abolitionists, and trying to declare himself to be no longer enslaved in this country, because he had relocated temporarily from Missouri up to Ohio and Illinois. Therefore, he said, I left the state of Missouri, so I'm supposed to be free. And he went before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court Chief Justice and their body, majority, said basically, and the Chief Justice was Taney, he says that no, you're not. He said, in this country, a black man is basically a non-citizen and he's property. You're non-citizens and you are property. And property and non-citizens have no rights. And as a black person, therefore, unlike anybody else from outside the country, you have no rights that a white person is bound to respect. He was not equating Dred Scott to an Asian or Arab or Hispanic or an Indian or a gay or a midget or humpback, anybody. He was talking about black folk, because black folk constitutionally, in the first Constitution, in the first 12 amendments from 1 through 12, it said black people are property, equal to a field animal, 3/5 of a human being. He says you have no rights, you're property. And so that was what the Dred Scott decision said in 1857. Now, a few liberal Republicans said, well, when the Civil War ended, they said, we got to go back and correct that Dred Scott decision, because that we can't have that. blacks are supposed to be free now because the Southern conservatives, red states in the country that are still supporting Donald Trump today. And then the Confederate states keep talking about we're going to rise again. We've attacked the United States once. We attacked the United States in the 1960s. And we're going to come back in 2020 and attack the United States again and take over. Because right now we're not going to ever give black folk those rights and privileges they're entitled to. And so what happens is that liberal Republicans after the Civil War says we got to do something to make sure that the rights of black folk are preserved constitutionally, not just in rhetoric. Let's preserve it. And so that they enacted through legislation the 13th Amendment, which says that black folk are now free, slavery is now forbidden, and black folk must be provided in all equal in all opportunities that whites are provided in the society. That is the original intent of the 13th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment followed that and said, now, if you're going to provide them, they must be, not only must you provide them freedom from slavery, but it's also mandated that every level of government, city government, county government, state government, and the federal government must exercise all necessary measures and mandates to make sure that the legacies of slavery, those legacies, those bad things that were happening to black folk, the images and everything else, the deprivation is lifted off of their shoulders. And that was that's the original intent of the 14th Amendment. And but yet nobody's going back to the original intent. So let's go to this civil rights law now, following that 14th Amendment in 1865 and 1866. What this says is that in this country, the only thing that a black person can be is there are two things they can be in this country. They're either going to be free or they're going to be slaves. But to be free as black people, native blacks in this country, not blacks coming in from Africa or Caribbean, any place else, or South America, for them to be free, they must minimally have what they've never were given. They were stripped of everything: rights, resources, religion, language, culture, history, name, everything. But minimally, they must have, to be a competitive people and regain those things, they must have 40 acres, a mule, and $100. And that so that we can reverse the Dred Scott decision, so they can have something. And because they're no longer be property, they can own property. That they no longer be non-citizens, they'll be citizens. And that's what the 14th Amendment said. And the Civil Rights Law was put into effect, saying that this is strictly and solely for black people, not for anyone else. And so its specific purpose is to reverse the Dred Scott decision of 1857. Now let's jump up about 4 years after that. By 1859, guess what? 1869, guess what? Some white meat laborers from New Orleans said they want to use the 14th Amendment. And so they went to the Supreme Court to try to use it. The Supreme Court says we are forced to tell you that no white person is entitled to use the 14th Amendment. It was written strictly and solely for black people, in alliance with the original intent of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the civil rights laws were written for one specific purpose: to make sure that they put black folk into a legal position where they can no longer be exploited, misused, subordinated, and re-enslaved in this country. And that was called a slaughterhouse case. That decision came out in 1872 out of the United States Supreme Court. And so consequently, blacks, those amendments became what's known as a second constitution for black folk. That stayed in effect up until about 1875. By 1875, some things happened in this country that said we got to reverse that condition. We got to reverse it, because the South then had cut a deal with the North, saying that you giving back our land, you gave amnesty to everybody who fought with the South. You gave amnesty to all the Confederate soldiers who fought. So you're no longer going to lynch them or castrate them or hang them for being terrorists. You're going to give them back everything that they had before slavery. When they did that, then the South got back all the land and all the privileges and rights, and they put it in what they call the Black Codes, or later was called Jim Crow resegregation, because they brought black folk back in again to re-enslave them. Why? Because they said they still needed, they can't have free slave labor. They needed cheap black labor. And so the peonage and codes and the black codes and there was came from an agreement between the North and the South, re-enslaved black folk, semi-enslaved them in the South. And when they did that, then at that point in time, they had to nullify the Dred Scott decision, or not the Dred Scott, but the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So the United States Supreme Court jumped into the battle and said, here's what we'll do. What we'll do is that we'll rule that most of those things that were given to black folk during what we call Reconstruction period that went from 1865 up to 1875, all that the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment and 9 civil rights laws, we'll rule them as being unconstitutional if they were pertaining to black folk. Now, the United States Supreme Court did not have that statutory authority, but nobody has challenged it. Our black leadership, our black lawyers have never challenged that. The United States Supreme Court has no constitutional authority to intervene in congressional enactments on behalf of black folk. 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment and the Civil Rights Law of 1866 was supposed to have been strictly for black folk. But the Supreme Court jumped in and exercised jurisdiction they did not have. They used it based on what we call the Marlborough and Madison decision of 1803. They took and generated some authority they did not have to go in and say that everything that was given to black folk following the Civil War it's going to be two things. That most of those laws will be ruled unconstitutional. The 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, those things now we would call them being neutral. That for everybody, anybody can go in there and use them and pretend that they're equal to black folk in this country. That's what killed off those efforts to reverse the Dred Scott decision of 1857. And they've been doing that over and over again. And so the Civil Rights Law of 1866 then became in 1964, President Johnson picked it up and says he had legislature enacted a law in 1964, which says that the Civil Rights Law is now for everybody. It's for minorities, poor folk, everything else. And that generated a women's movement in this country. It generated a gay movement in this country, a handicap movement in this country. It generated everything. Everybody became equal to black folk on paper, and in reality, they came in and went over black folk. That's why black folk in the same subordinated position that they were in during Jim Crow segregation and slavery. They're in the same identical position. Nothing has changed. So consequently, and in summary, there were laws that were passed in the second Constitution to reverse the Dred Scott decision of 1857, but the United States Supreme Court cut a deal and allowed a deal to happen between the North and the South to keep black folks subordinated. Supreme Court put the icing on the cake and said, y'all are neutralized out, and that reverses. So the reversal of the 1857 Dred Scott decision does not apply. So you're still where you were in 1857. Black people are still now suffering under the Dred Scott decision, because even though the second Constitution was instituted and legislated, the general broad white population has refused to accept it. The Supreme Court has neutralized it, won't accept it. That's why in this country now, just like it was in 1860, 98% of all the whites in the country opposed freeing the slaves in 1860. Now, after 150 years, 88% of all the whites in the country still do not want to be associated with blacks, and they harbor some hatred and disgust and some ill feelings about black in America. That the racism in America has gone down 10 points in 150 years. So the Dred Scott decision, in fact, legislatively, it was supposed to be reversed, but the Dred Scott decision was not reversed by the United States Supreme Court, and the general white population overruled it, corrupted it, and sent it back to where it was in 1857. Thank you, and I'll see you at the next Powernomics.com, connecting the dots.